Okay, so this is a video on membrane transport. We're going to talk about two different ways in general that things get across, but then six specific ways. So energy is needed. We've got passive transport. It's kind of laid back. Whereas if energy is needed, it's active. We got to use some energy to push things in or out. Um, so we're going to cover diffusion osmosis, facilitated diffusion for passive. We're going to cover active transport specifically, endocytosis and exocytosis as well. So we start with a model like this. And if we start with diffusion, we've got small things that are going from where they're crowded or high concentration to where they're not crowded. And they can go in or out depending on where they are more crowded. But since they're small and they aren't charged, they can go through without any assistance. Next, we have osmosis. So again, it's just like diffusion, but because water is so important, we give it its own unique name. And where the concentration of solute is higher, the water is going to flow in that direction. We also have facilitated diffusion. These molecules are larger or charged, and they need help. So they can't cross the lipid bilayer on their own, so they get a channel to flow through. And those three right there are going to not need any kind of energy because they're going in the normal direction and they're pretty simple. When we start getting into this world of energy, whenever you hear energy in biology, you should be thinking ATP. So that's what these big red exclamation points represent, is energy being used. And with active transport, it's not simply a channel, but it's a pump. So we need help here. And why do we need help? Because we're trying to take a molecule and make it more crowded. It doesn't want to go in this direction, but if we're going to force it to be at a higher concentration, then it needs energy to be pumped across and forced across. We also have exocytosis, exit the cell. Cyto is cell, exo is exit. So we're taking large amounts of things, bulk, and we are going to release it and spit it all out at once. We can also do endocytosis, where we also have a form of bulk transport that requires energy, where we can engulf or swallow up something really big, such as bacteria. All right, so specifically, osmosis. Again, when we're thinking of osmosis, you should be thinking water transporting. And water molecules are always going to go where the concentration of solute is higher. So they're going to chase the solute, try and make this more dilute, try to make this the same as that. So in this kind of a situation, if the solute is the green, the water would go in. It's going to chase the higher concentration of solute. In this one over here, it's going to go out. The water is going to go out because it's going to chase the higher concentration of solute. This one, where it's already balanced, water will still cross the membrane, but it's going to do so at an equal rate. So we call it at equilibrium. So diffusion. Diffusion is simple. It doesn't need any help in the form of energy or a protein channel or pump. It's small non-polar molecules that are going to go from a high concentration to a low concentration. So they're going from being crowded to where they're not crowded. The most classic example of this is when we look at carbon dioxide and oxygen. So our cells, as they break down carbohydrates for energy, are going to produce CO2. We want to get rid of that CO2. So as CO2 builds up inside the cells, it's going to exit the cells and get picked up by red blood cells. And at the same time, in order to keep on doing cellular respiration and keep on breaking down carbohydrates, all cells need oxygen. So the oxygen is going to go from where there's a lot of it in the red blood cells, and it's going to travel into our own cells. As these red blood cells get rid of oxygen and gain carbon dioxide, they're going to make their way to the lungs. And in the lungs, they now have a lot of carbon dioxide, and in the lungs, there's actually not very much. So it's going to go from high concentration of carbon dioxide on the red blood cell and into the lungs. And as you breathe in, you're going to have a lot of oxygen in your lungs, and that's going to diffuse into your bloodstream and to the red blood cells, and the red blood cells will pick up that oxygen. Okay, so facilitated diffusion, if something's bigger it might need help. It can't just cross the membrane on its own because they'll get blocked by these lipid fatty tails here. So facilitated diffusion uses a protein channel, and big things can then transport through those. So the example we talk about here is in your intestines. You've eaten some food, you've used digestive enzymes to break it down really small, but even though it's really small, it's still too big to get through the lipid bilayer. So we need a protein here. So like fructose, you eat some fruit, you have fruit sugar in your intestine. And that needs to get into your bloodstream and delivered to all of your cells for energy. So it's going to go through the lining of your intestine and to your blood vessels by going through these little channels. So it's going to go from high concentration after you just eat, and it's going to go to low concentration inside the cell, which ends up building up, and then ultimately the lowest concentration is out here in the blood, and that fructose will transport through another channel on this side and into the blood and then to all the other cells in your body. And that's facilitated diffusion. Big things going from high to low concentration using a protein channel. Active transport is the first one that we're talking about that's using energy. And again, you can see like this all electric-y looking ATP. Whenever you see ATP, you should be thinking energy. And the reason we need energy is because we're taking something and forcing it to a higher concentration. So if you see this diagram here, these little dark orange diamonds, there's only 2 on this side, but there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the other. So if we're going to force them to be more crowded, it takes a pump and it takes ATP to force them across to be more crowded. Now, the classic example of this and where it's so important is in your nervous cells, in your neurons. So as you send an electrical impulse, you're really sending that impulse through ions. So we build up voltage on the inside by opening a channel and letting sodium flood in because sodium's crowded up here. As it floods in, we need these pumps to force the sodium back out to the outside. It's still more sodium out here. So it's active transport. Even though it flooded in and created voltage, your sodium still needs to get put back out. And it's going to go from low concentration to high concentration and require ATP to do that. The other type of active transport, things that require energy, are bulk transport, and exocytosis is one of those things. So inside your cell, you have your DNA, and it's full of recipes, and the RNA molecules carry the recipes to ribosomes, and ribosomes will help assemble the proteins by assembling amino acids. And all those proteins, if they're meant to go outside the cell, will get packed into these little vesicles. Okay, so we have an outer membrane, but we also have membrane-bound organelles inside the cell. As our nucleic acids, our DNA, are storing genes and making proteins, if we want to send a message to another cell, we take all those hormones and we get rid of them. We exit the cell with those. So they're in these vesicles and they get transported to the membrane, and then they get like ejected or secreted or spit out. Okay, so that's another type of transport or how things get across membranes that requires energy. Last one we're looking at here is endo, in. So depending on the type of cell, if we're taking in large amounts all at once, like for example, if we would take in a bacteria that we would want to destroy before it destroys us, we would want to keep it isolated from everything else inside of our cell. So we can pick it up and now we put it in its own vesicle. And as it's in its own vesicle, now it can't hurt us. And we can end up bringing over a lysosome to secrete digestive enzymes and destroy it. But endocytosis, if we're taking in large amounts of material and we're going to put it in a vesicle, that's endocytosis. It always goes in. So again, we've got 3 types of passive transport that do not require energy, and we have 3 types of active transport that do require ATP or energy. If we look at this chart, osmosis, you hear osmosis, you think water. Diffusion, it's small nonpolar things. They don't need any assistance, and they're going to go from high to low concentration. Facilitated diffusion, they need the help of a protein channel because they're going to take something really big and try and get it across. And it's going to go the same way as diffusion, from high to low concentration. Now, when we start needing energy, we start talking about the forms of active transport. So our specific active transport is going to pump larger charged molecules from low to high concentration. We can pump in, we can pump out, but if we're going to force it to be more crowded than it wants to, we have to force it with energy. Exocytosis, we take bulk amounts out, that takes ATP, and endocytosis, we take bulk amounts in, and that requires ATP. So again, this is our 6 types of transport, what substances are involved, and examples here, and where is it going, and only 2 of these are only in or out. The other 2, it all depends on the concentrations or how crowded things are. And then all of these, whether they need channels or pumps or energy. So that's our forms of transport. Hopefully that's helpful. And that's that.